Our previous lecture surveyed religious and literary aspects of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Today, we will look at the relationship between ancient Near Eastern myths and the Bible. In the 19th century, the educated public in the United States and in Europe was confronted with the publication of documents from the ancient Near East that had only recently been deciphered. You will recall that it was in the early to mid-19th century that the great decipherment work took place of Egyptian, of the cuneiform languages. Within decades, the material was published, people began to read it, and there were very powerful reactions to it. As they read these documents, they found, among other things, accounts of creation, stories of a universal flood, tales of days of judgment when humans would be judged in a kind of final moment in which their fate would be decided. And reading these, they naturally questioned the relationship of this material to the Bible and their own relationship to the Bible. That is, the Bible was the foundational text of Christian life, especially in Protestant Europe, where we have the notion of sola scriptura, advanced by the Reformation leaders. The Bible is the source of authority, not the church. Well, if the Bible is the source of authority, what does it mean that there are now texts that may be older than the Bible, or that seem to challenge the Bible in some way? New methods of literary criticism were applied to the Bible, and they suggested that there was influence. Earlier texts had influenced the Bible. Well, was the Bible a text that could be influenced? Wasn't it divine? So what was this speech of influencing? In my lecture, I'll describe various responses to these challenges, both secular and religious, because really what we have here is a crisis of belief, and there were very creative responses to this crisis. They ranged from a complete rejection of the findings, that is, it's not true that there were ancient texts. You're mistaken if you think they're older than the Bible, to various strategies of accommodation with findings that proved in the end to be scientific. Now, there were four challenges to authority, to biblical authority and historicity in the mid-19th century. The first, which I alluded to in two earlier lectures, was the challenge from the science, the emerging science of geology. The biblical chronology suggested that the world, human habitation on the world, was only 6,000 years old, and that the earth itself was created within what for the Bible was historical memory. The Bible begins with an account of creation. Humans knew of creation. Well, here was geology showing that the crust of the earth was, in the first reports, tens of thousands of years old. Of course, now we know it's much older, but imagine you're in 1850 Boston reading this, and you read that the earth is not 6,000 years old, it's 42,000 years old. What does this do to your sense of chronology, which had been conditioned by biblical numbers? Let us pay homage again to Bishop Ussher and his claim that the world was created on October 22nd in 4004 BC. So it was only 6,000 or so years old. A second great challenge, the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of the Species in 1859. What did this do? It upset people's acceptance, widespread acceptance of the idea presented in the first chapters in Genesis that the creation of humans was a separate act of creation than the creation of animals. The creation of humans by will. God decides to create humans. Let me remind you of the verse in Genesis. Let us create man in our image. Understood in most of the commentarial traditions to be God speaking in the divine we, or God consulting with the angelic hosts. Humans are the crown of creation, according to the biblical account, created through speech. Well, human evolution, as posited by Darwin, challenged this, and challenged it very powerfully. A third challenge, biblical criticism, a form of literary criticism as applied to the Bible. Literary criticism had previously been applied to the Greek myths, to Homer specifically. Now, some of these same theorists and their students were looking at the Bible in the same way. They posited a documentary hypothesis that the text of the Hebrew Bible, specifically the text of the 5 books of Moses, on which this theory focused, were really separate documents. There were different numbers in the theories, 4 or 5 or 6, that had been edited at some final point in the last centuries before the Christian era. So the Bible did not arrive in one package, which is what the common assumption was. With my undergraduates, I try to convey this in this way, that for the people in the 19th century, they imagined that the Bible was dropped, revealed in one moment. In our terms, we might think of the Bible as coming in an email attachment. Zap. It's all there, nothing changed, no one edited it, no one tampered with the file. That's the Bible, and you must accept it. Well, in a sense, the whole notion of evolution, here I'm going back to Darwin, the whole notion of evolution gets into culture. Culture evolves, so a text such as the Bible also evolved. Scholars pointed to the 2 creation accounts in the book of Genesis. There are 2 stories in the first 2 chapters. One tells us that man and woman were created together at one time. The other account tells us that woman is created from Adam's rib. Now, the biblical commentators have a way of explaining this seeming contradiction, but for literary scholars, the answer was simple. There were 2 documents. They had been joined together or redacted. So we have the challenge of geology, the challenge of evolution, and the challenge of biblical criticism. And finally, and this is the most central to our discussion today, we have the challenge of the ancient Near Eastern texts. For the decipherment of these texts presented the public with stories that challenge their notion of biblical originality. And once you challenge the notion of biblical originality, you also challenge authority. Originality is something that people can overlook, but authority they can't overlook. If one is supposed to conduct one's life according to the Bible, and the Bible is itself a derived text, then why, people ask, should they continue to conduct their lives that way? It may be hard for us in an age of skepticism to understand the power of this challenge. It was overwhelming for 19th century educated people. It was very much as if UFOs had landed. The UFOs were these new scientific ideas, which showed them that the Bible was not an original document, that the Bible derived from other cultures, and that there had been a full cultural flowering before the Bible. Explorers and archaeologists, among them clergymen, were drawn to the question of ancient Near Eastern texts and to the way that these texts were found. So we have a curious phenomenon of many clergymen who were also at the same time professors. In the 19th century, there was a real combination of the professorship and the clergy, especially in American Protestant institutions. These people were drawn to archaeology. And here we have one of the responses to the crisis. They said, we can become engaged in this science, the science of studying the Bible, and use it to buttress the authority of the Bible. We can show that archaeology might in some ways challenge biblical authority, but other aspects of archaeology can prove the Bible to be true. And here we have something that still operates throughout the United States. Seminars and excavations often held in the summer, heavily attended by people who are interested in biblical studies, which the seminars attempt to prove the biblical truth, and they use that phrase, by going to sites associated with biblical history. Now, those people, other than clergymen, who were excavating in the Near East, were very quick to understand the appeal of the biblical connection to the ancient Near Eastern texts and to the way which they were found. I've mentioned a number of times one of my culture heroes, Sir Leonard Woolley, the great British archaeologist, who it does not seem was deeply religious, but who understood that for the public, the connection to the Bible was all important. So when he excavated in the city of Ur in Iraq, he made sure to highlight the connection between Abraham and Ur. Although his excavations had nothing to do with Abraham, they were of the royal cemetery of Ur from the 3rd millennium, which long preceded Abraham. These excavators found that believers were willing to countenance the project of archaeology linked to the Bible if they felt that the project could lend some credence to biblical accounts. The greatest challenge from the Near Eastern texts to the idea of biblical originality came from the flood narratives discovered in the 19th century. In a very dramatic 1872 lecture, the British scholar George Adam Smith spoke to a large audience and said that he was going to read them from the text of the Babylonian Noah. That was his phrase. His source was the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which had been unearthed long before in the excavations of Nineveh near the city of Mosul in Iraq, a city I'm sure you've heard of if you've been listening to the news recently. The tablet tells of Utnapishtim, a hero of this tablet who survived the flood and gained immortality. Let us hear some of this tablet from the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There was a city called Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates. It was very old, and so many were the gods within it. They converged in their complex hearts on the idea of creating a great flood. There was Anu, their aging and weak-minded father, the military Enlil, his advisor, Ishtar, the sensation-craving one, and all the rest. Ea, who was present at their council, came to my house, and frightened by the violent winds that filled the air, echoed all that they were planning and had said. In this opening fragment of the tablet, we see that the flood is going to be brought by a congregation of the gods. The gods confer, they argue. And in our series, we've already met some of these gods. We've met Ishtar, also known as Inanna in Sumerian, the goddess of love and war. And we've met Ea, also known as Enki. I called him the administrator god, the organizer god, the god who favors humanity. What is his job in this story? He's coming to people, to one person, and he's going to tell them about the flood. What does he tell them? Men of Shuruppak, he said, tear down your house and build a ship. Abandon your possessions and the works that you find beautiful and crave, and save your life instead. Into the ship bring the seed of all living creatures. And now we hear the voice of Utnapishtim again. I was overawed, perplexed, and finally downcast. I agreed to do as Ea said, but I protested. What shall I say to the city, the people, the leaders? Tell them, Ea said, you have learned that Enlil, the war god, despises you and will not give you access to the city anymore. Tell them this, for Ea will bring the rains. So the people are forewarned, very much like the story in the Bible, but instead of the God of monotheism, the God of the Bible, we have a confusion of gods. with different motives, we will see as the poem progresses, and different reasons. And in a sense, it's more like a Greek idea. They don't really have a reason. Fate ordains that this is supposed to happen. And what's lovely about this poem is that there are interjections, because remember, we're hearing a story that Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, is telling to Gilgamesh, and he is telling us that story. So this is very complex layering. This is the way the gods think, he laughed. His tone of savage irony frightened Gilgamesh, yet gave him pleasure being his friend. And now we have Utnapishtim's voice. He's been told to warn the people of the flood. But who am I to talk? He sighed as if disgusted with himself. I did as he commanded me to do. I spoke to them, and some came out to help me build the ship of 7 stories, each with 9 chambers. The boat was cube in shape and sound. It held the food and wine and precious minerals and seed of living animals we put in it. My family then moved inside, and all who wanted to be with us there. And then he enumerates who came with him. Remember back to the story in the Bible where species are brought onto the boats. 2 of every animal, 7 of certain animals. The game of the field, the goats of the steppe, the craftsmen of the city came. A navigator came. Well, this is very smart, right? If you're going to have a boat and you're going to have a flood, bring a navigator. Here again, I'd like to remind you of the practicality of those people. They're telling a fabulous story, but they remember to bring the pilot, right? And then Ea ordered me to close the door. The time of the great rains had come. Oh, there was ample warning, yes, my friend, but it was terrifying still. Buildings blown by the winds for miles like desert brush. People clung to the branches of trees until roots gave away. New possessions, now debris, floated on the water with their special sterile vacancy. The riverbanks failed to hold the water back. Even the gods cowered like dogs at what they had done. Well, this is not a notion very biblical, is it? The gods caused something. Now they're not so sure about what they did. They're frightened at their own power that they've unleashed. So it's such an interesting document. It's at the same time more fantastic than the biblical story, but in a sense it's more intimate, it's more human. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. There's going to be an atomic bomb. There's a flood. Now one of the gods, the goddess, speaks. Ishtar cried out like a woman at the height of labor. Oh, how could I have wanted to do this to my people? And now there's another one of these interesting parenthetical notes. They were hers, notice. Even her sorrow was possessive. Her spawn that she had killed too soon. Old gods are terrible to look at when they weep, all bloated like spoiled fish. One wonders if they ever understood that they have caused their own grief. Okay, we move away from the interjection and back to the narrative. When the 7th day came, the flood subsided from its slaughter like hair drawn slowly back from a tormented face. I looked at the earth, and all was silence. Bodies lay like alewives, dead and in the clay. I fell down on the ship's deck and wept. Why? Why did they have to die? I could not understand. I asked unanswerable questions a child asks when a parent dies, for nothing. Only slowly did I make myself believe or hope they might all be swept up in their fragments together and made whole again by some compassionate hand. I read you the beginning of the 11th tablet, a very powerful piece of writing. I remind you, this is redacted, edited, shaped by 1300 BC. So this is now 3,300 years old. This is a very artful translation in an American literary idiom. And I've chosen a number of translations to work from in conveying these myths, and especially with the Epic of Gilgamesh, because no one translation really can capture all the nuances of the original. Now, imagine something close to this translation being read in 1872 in London to a society of assembled Christian clergymen, academicians, and royalty. The nobility was also assembled. Smith called this the Babylonian Noah, but he did not present it as a refutation of the Bible. He didn't stand up there and say, look, this tells us X about the Bible. He presented it as science, as literature, in the tradition of British exploration and discovery, the Royal Society tradition. But it was taken as a challenge by many people, both by polemicists who wanted to challenge the Bible and, in response, by people who wanted to, quote, defend its historicity. So the flood accounts figure largely in our story of challenge and response in the 19th century. And, I should say, in the 20th and 21st century. This conversation is still going on, the conversation about the Bible in the ancient Near East. But its true efflorescence was in the 19th century. Now, another aspect of ancient Near Eastern mythology that challenged the biblically oriented believers was creation account. The Bible opens with a creation account. The Mesopotamians had numerous creation accounts. In their various successive civilizations, they accounted for the creation of the world and humanity, but not in an opening way, not in a way that was fundamental. Rather, we learn about their ideas from other texts. And in a later lecture on creation accounts, I'll be looking at those texts more closely. As in Genesis, their accounts speak of separation, separation of heaven and earth, separation of the waters below from the waters above, separation of the sweet water, that is the water of springs and rivers, from the salt water of the ocean. So the notion of creation is keeping things apart. We also find this in Egyptian accounts. And in Egyptian and Mesopotamian accounts, we find something similar to the biblical idea of creation through speech. It's very articulate in the opening of the Bible. God said, and it came into being. Each of the days of creation ends this way. Well, I should say it begins that way and ends that way. In the end, we're told, and it was good. The creation was good. In Egypt, we have the idea that the god Ptah, in charge of language, had a hand to play in creation. But this is mixed with other Egyptian ideas. There's a wonderful Egyptian notion that humans are created out of clay, which we also find in the Bible. But in the Bible, they're shaped by God. In one ancient Egyptian myth, a lump of clay is put at the potter's wheel, and the god shapes the human on the potter's wheel. So we are shaped literally the way pots are made. Well, here's another challenge. The Bible doesn't offer the only creation account. Here are other creation accounts. Like the flood account, this seems to question biblical originality. A third challenge from the texts, tales of heroes. The more that ancient Near Eastern mythology was translated and published, the more people could see that the heroes of the ancient Near East, Gilgamesh, Sargon of Akkad, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, all had stories which showed common threads with stories in the Bible. I will focus for a moment on the story of Sargon of Akkad, the great unifier of ancient Iraq. We could think of him as the first Akkadian king. Now, his story, like the story of Gilgamesh, kept reverberating through the centuries. And what we read of him reminded many people of the story of Moses in Exodus. I'll read you a fragment from a poem about Sargon of Akkad. My mother conceived me, in secret she bore me. She put me in a basket made of rushes, With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. He appointed me as his gardener. When I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. Ishtar, again, the goddess of war and love. And for years I exercised kingship. So he arises to greatness from obscurity. And notice the remarkable similarities to the Moses story. His mother bearing him and hiding him, putting him in a basket, floating him down the river. He's brought up by people other than the people in his family. Finally, he is revealed and he rises to kingship, to leadership. Well, when people read this, they were very startled and they needed a way to respond. So let us look at some of the ways they responded to these challenges, the challenges of the ancient Near Eastern texts. One way, a way that's not really any longer with us but needs to be noted, is complete denial. Well, this is always one possibility with a challenge. I've read many of these responses. It was simply to deny the antiquity and authenticity of the archaeological finds, to say they were hoaxes. That was very common. Of course, there were hoaxes, many, but there were also many real finds. One tract I read, one 19th century tract, said that the devil had planted these finds and texts. That is, there was something demonic about this material because its purpose was to challenge your sense of belief. So denial, now denial as a strategy was not very successful, and as archaeology grew more sophisticated and there was real scientific proof, people could no longer deny this material. A more nuanced, subtle response emerged. And what this did, and this is very much with this, it privileged the biblical text. It said there was something unique about the biblical text, but it didn't dismiss the archaeological record. Rather, it sought in the archaeological record proof that the essence of the biblical picture was correct. Not every detail had to be correct, but the general picture that you get from the Bible's accounts are correct. There was a Jericho, and it was destroyed. Was it destroyed by a procession of trumpeters blowing their horns and causing the walls to fall? Perhaps not. Only someone who asserts biblical inerrancy might say that. But someone who wants to believe biblical historicity and yet believe the archaeological record could say that. Still somewhat problematic because the ruins of Jericho, however the walls fell, don't fit into the chronology of the Bible. Still problematic, but it can be assimilated somehow. So I'm calling this the more nuanced response. There were philosophical responses. Yes, there were affinities between the Bible and the ancient Near East, but these are structural, not in deep content. The claim here was that the Bible had a sort of ethical superiority. These texts were the products of pagan culture. The Bible, the product of a monotheistic culture, was the privileged one. Now, this argument about the historicity of the Bible and the challenge of texts came into discourse in the 19th century and is still with us today, and I will be referring to it many times during subsequent lectures. We've examined in our lecture 4 challenges to biblical authority: geology, evolution, biblical criticism, and ancient Near Eastern texts. We have focused on those texts, the texts in which our myths are recorded, and I surveyed briefly some of the responses to these challenges to biblical authority and originality. In our next lecture, we will move to descriptions of the gods that are depicted in the ancient Near Eastern myths. I will be surveying the pantheons of Egypt and of Mesopotamia.